Hey guys, welcome to some more bonus content with the intersection of Christianity and politics. And in today's lesson, we're going to look at two quick things. One, how does what we just covered in this series apply to apologetics? And then we're going to do a fairly comprehensive overview of the concept of delegated authority. And it's this whole idea that God has instituted every aspect of life, and in that creation, he has made it where he has delegated his authority to individuals to carry out the God-given task of that area of life. And so we'll dive deep into that in just a minute. But first, let's get into how does this series apply to apologetics? Well, the first thing we looked at was God-given rights versus civil rights. And there's definitely an overlap there. We went into the Constitution a little bit. We looked at how Christianity and politics mix. And one of the takeaways from that is that there are some rights in which God gives us. Even our Constitution says that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, which means those rights cannot be taken away. They are not given by man, so man cannot take them away. They're given by God. Therefore, man cannot take them away, and God won't either. And then there are civil rights. These are rights that the government does institute and protect and give their people. And so one of the reasons this applies to apologetics is understanding that distinction and why it's important. And I hope the lesson on does religion and politics mix cover that pretty well. One of the reasons we want to talk about rights is because there's a growing movement of Christians, particularly pastors from mainline churches, that proclaim that we don't need to worry about our rights, that we're too concerned about our rights, and that Jesus wasn't concerned about his rights. And I have to respectfully disagree. First of all, while Jesus did not have much to say about our rights, Paul did. He, in fact, used his rights as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar. So he knew his rights, and he used it for the purpose of advancing the gospel. Another reason why we need to be concerned about our rights and know what they are is so that we can continue to spread the gospel, that we can proclaim truth even when it becomes more and more unpopular. As a point of contrast, in Canada, there are certain parts of the Bible that are now banned from being preached. And so you cannot preach on certain controversial topics in the nation of Canada. And we don't need that in America. We need to be able to preserve the freedom of speech and to be able to preach the entire counsel of God. Not only that, we need the ability to have the freedom to evangelize, to tell others the good news of Jesus, and to try to get people to turn to Christ and become a Christian. And we need to be able to protect those rights. And we don't need the IRS or other government entities interfering with what pastors can say from the pulpit. Well, another thing that this series hopefully developed was biblical wisdom, seeing how the Bible is wise and how it portrays how government is designed to run. If we live that out, then we'll be better off, because there's practical consequences to different policies, different government structures, different economies. And we want to live according to how God designed it, because that's going to be the best way to live. And on that point, it acts as an evidence for the Bible, because we can see that the way God designed things works best. So when we look at, say, economic theories, you can have a free market economy, you can have a regulated free market economy, you can have a more controlled economy with, say, socialism. And then you can have a very heavily regulated economy with different forms of socialism and communism. Even on that point, the Bible makes it clear that people are to have private property. They own what is theirs, and they have a responsibility to be good stewards of what God has entrusted them, and they have the ability to buy and sell and use the money that they've earned wisely. And that's very compatible with what we have here in America. Under, say, by contrast, a communist government, under communism, there is no private property. It's actually abolished. And that means that everything in your possession is not yours. In fact, the government owns it and can take it away at will. Now, there's probably different forms of that, but the idea is the means of production, the means of prospering under a more free market society is in the hands of the people. Under a more communistic society, by contrast, it's in the hands of the government. And so we can see that America has flourished by our way of allowing people to take risk with their money, invest. Just in the past week or so from the recording of this video, we saw SpaceX go launch. And that was a private industry funding that and getting that up there. Now, it was a cooperation with NASA, but Elon Musk and Tesla, that's a privately owned company. He used his money and took that risk, and it's paid off well for them. So lots of different areas that this can apply, but it all points back to the way God designed things works best. But another area is good theology. This series applies to apologetics because we need to have good theology, know why we believe what we believe. For good theology, we need to understand a biblical worldview, how the Bible shapes how we view all areas of life, and that the Bible applies to all areas of life. And in fact, I'm going to do a short series at some point on the biblical worldview to really flesh it out. According to recent studies, less than 9% of Americans have a biblical worldview. And that's staggeringly sad. That's terrible. And so I'm going to pull up some of those studies, look at the questions that were asked, some of the responses that were given, and we'll do that in a different series. But for government, we need to know what to aim for, what policies should work well, which one should be avoided. And part of that is having a worldview that's shaped by the Bible. Applying theology of man and the fall. Now, this is a big one because going back to worldview, your view of mankind shapes how you think society should be structured. If you think mankind is basically good, you're going to have different policies than having understanding that mankind is inherently sinful, that we have an inclination to do wrong, and that a lot of problems in society are due to either bad decisions or the fallen nature of the world. And so we develop this theology of man and say, hey, we're made in the image of God. And because of that, we have inherent value, dignity, and worth. And that is unique to the Bible. And so if you're going to compare the Bible to secular humanism, Christianity to secular humanism, then you have two totally different starting points, which impacts where you might end up. And because of that, we need to value all life, everything from conception until death. And that impacts policies. Are we going to allow euthanasia for senior citizens? Are we going to allow abortion? Are we going to view all of mankind, as equal before God? We are one blood. We are all descendants of Adam by way of being all descendants of Noah. We are all in the same family. We have equal worth and dignity. Now, if you compare that or contrast that to secular humanism, you could say maybe one ethnic group is more evolved than another. And that argument was used a century ago, that some ethnic groups just didn't have the mental capacity to be able to do certain things, to be able to function as well as others. And that's just a very evolutionary way of viewing things. But under a creation standpoint, we view that God made man in his image. And because of that, there are a lot of ramifications that we need to consider. Applying the theology of government. How do we understand the biblical role of government? Well, I hope my lesson on that helped spell that out a little bit. The primary purpose of government, according to the Bible, is to establish justice. In other words, have laws and enforce those laws and have a judicial system that punishes those that do wrong. Another role of government is to protect the nation through national defense. And so those are two key areas of the purpose of government. Now, beyond that, it's depending on the form of government. But I'll let you go back and watch the lesson on that to develop that theme. And of course, we contrast it to bad forms of government. And that helps us better see the contrast of a good government versus a not so good government, because there's a whole spectrum of them. That's the difficulty in politics, is there's so many nuances, so many exceptions, so many circumstances that it's hard to get clear pictures on things, and so too easy to paint with a broad brush, which is why we had to have thoughtful conversations about these things. So those are just some ways that apologetics can be used here. I'd like to add a bonus that as you learn to talk about politics, you learn how to talk about deeply held beliefs and issues that matter. And that applies to apologetics. I mean, religion is one of the most important things in people's lives, and we need to learn how to talk to people about that. And then the final way in which Christianity and politics applies to apologetics is the concept of delegated authority. It's a theme that we see throughout the Bible, and it's hardly ever taught in churches, but it's this idea that God delegates to different institutions, such as the church, the government, and the family, certain roles, and they have the authority to fulfill those roles. And so I've prepared a video for you that should be next in the playlist. Check it out on my channel. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.